My name is Dr. Alastair Finch. By profession, I am a botanist, specializing in the resilient ecologies of high-altitude flora. For years, my work was confined to sterile laboratories and the hushed halls of academia, a world of peer-reviewed papers and grant proposals. But theory can only take you so far. I crave the raw, unfiltered data of the field. A period of prolonged immersion in an environment untouched by the ceaseless hum of human activity. The seasonal post as a fire lookout in the Shoshone National Forest, bordering Yellowstone, presented the perfect opportunity. A paid sabbatical in a living laboratory. It promised solitude, a spectacular vantage point, and uninterrupted time to complete my research. I accepted the position with an academic's quiet enthusiasm, entirely unprepared for the other, unlisted aspects of the job. The journey to the tower was the final shedding of one world and the entry into another. A Tastern Park Service ranger named Miller drove me the last 20 miles in a rattling pickup truck, up a road that was less a road and more a suggestion carved into the mountainside. The air grew thinner, cooler. The scent of pine and damp, ancient earth became so thick it was almost a taste. When Miller finally killed the engine, the silence that rushed in to fill the void was absolute. It was a physical presence, a weight on the eardrums. It was the sound of a world without people. "This is it," he grunted, gesturing with his chin toward a thin steel skeleton that rose from a small, rocky clearing. Shoshone Lookout. Home sweet home. The tower was a study in functional fragility. It stood 100 feet tall, a lattice of weathered steel beams and guy wires anchored into the granite bedrock. At its apex sat a single 14 by 14-foot room, a glass box perched precariously over an ocean of green. As I hauled my gear, books, scientific instruments, and a month's worth of non-perishable food, up the 133 steps, the world expanded with every foot of elevation. By the time I reached the top, breathless and sweating despite the chill, the view was staggering. I was on an island in the sky. Below me, an unbroken canopy of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir rolled away in every direction, a vast, undulating sea of green and shadow that stretched to a horizon serrated by the distant, snow-dusted peaks of the Absaroka Range. The sheer scale of it was humbling, almost violent in its immensity. It was a landscape that had existed long before humanity and would exist long after. My presence here felt like a fleeting statistical anomaly. This was the isolation I had craved, but seeing it laid bare was different from imagining it. It was a profound, crushing solitude, a beauty so vast it verged on menace. Miller gave me a brief tour of the cabin, which was a simple affair. A small bed was folded against one wall, a wood-burning stove stood in a corner, and a desk with a large map of the region bolted to its surface sat before the panoramic windows. In the center of the room was the Osborne Fire Finder, a brass and steel instrument for pinpointing the location of smoke. He showed me the two-way radio, explaining its limited range and the best times to get a clear signal. "You'll be fine," he said, his hand already on the latch of the trapdoor. "It's a quiet post. Nothing ever happens here." He gave a curt nod and was gone. his footsteps echoing down the metal stairs. A few minutes later, the distant rumble of his truck's engine faded, and the great silence settled back over the world. I was alone. The predecessor's testament. The first few days were idyllic. I fell into a routine governed by the sun. I would wake at dawn, make coffee, and conduct a 360-degree sweep of the horizon with my binoculars. I spent my days reading, making notes for a potential paper on high-altitude vegetation, and simply watching the wilderness breathe. I was creating a small bastion of order and reason in my glass box, a fortress of the mind against the overwhelming emptiness outside. It was on the third day, during a thorough cleaning of the cabin, that I found it. The official logbook, thick leather, bound volume, sat on a small shelf beneath the radio. Its pages were filled with the neat, blocky handwriting of previous lookouts, detailing weather patterns, smoke sightings, and supply deliveries. Tucked inside the back cover, I found a single sheet of A4 paper, yellowed with age and sealed in a cracked, cloudy laminate. The top of the page bore a simple, typewritten title: Shoshone Tower, Staying Safe. I smiled. A list of folksy wisdom from my predecessor. It was a common enough thing. A way for these lonely sentinels to pass on hard-won knowledge and feel a connection to those who would follow. I pulled up a chair and began to read, an amused curiosity guiding my eyes down the page. The first few rules were exactly what I expected: practical, sensible advice born from experience. Then, the tone began to shift. It was a subtle change at first, a slide from the practical into the peculiar. The straightforward advice about bears gave way to instructions that seemed to be missing their context, hinting at a logic I couldn't grasp. By the end of the list, the amusement had curdled into a faint, prickling unease. The rules had transitioned from the realm of safety into the realm of ritual. They were no longer about surviving the forest. They seemed to be about surviving the tower itself. Here is the list, exactly as I found it. 1. Check the guy wires for tension every morning and after any storm with winds over 40 mph. This tower is old. 2. Don't leave food scraps or packaging outside. The bears are one thing, the smaller critters are the real problem. 3. The radio is for official business and emergencies only. Reception is best between 0800 and 1100. 4. If you hear singing on the radio after midnight, it's not the radio. Turn the unit off, and do not turn it on again until sunrise. Don't try to make out the words. 5. Keep the windows polished. It doesn't like looking through filth. 6. Sometimes you'll see a lone hiker on the trail below. Do not hail them. They are not lost. 7. Never count the trees in the Eastern Valley. You'll get the number wrong every time, and it notices when you try. I read the list twice, then a third time. Singing on the radio. A lone hiker who wasn't lost. Polishing the windows for something that doesn't like looking through filth. And the final, bizarre injunction against counting trees. It was absurd. Clearly, it was a prank, a creative piece of fiction designed to spook the new arrival. It was a common trope in stories about isolated places. The list of strange rules that hint at a hidden, terrifying reality. My predecessor, I concluded, had a vivid imagination and a dark sense of humor, likely a coping mechanism for the profound solitude of the post. It was a psychological artifact, nothing more. I chuckled, shaking my head at the cleverness of it, and tucked the laminated sheet back into the logbook. First tremors. That evening, I sat at the desk, a textbook on alpine ecology open before me, the light from my battery-powered lamp a warm, solitary beacon against the encroaching darkness. The wind sighed around the tower, a low, mournful sound that was becoming familiar. I made an entry in my personal log, a new journal I had brought for the purpose. Day 3. Weather clear, visibility excellent. No smoke sighted. Discovered a curious document today, apparently left by a former occupant. A list of rules for the tower, escalating from the practical to the patently absurd. A fascinating example of psychological transference, or perhaps simple a cabin fever, manifesting as folklore. The human mind's need to create narrative and meaning, even, or perhaps especially, in a vacuum of stimulus, is a powerful force. I've filed it away as a cultural curiosity. As I wrote, I found my gaze drifting to the great eastern window. The valley below was a pool of absolute blackness, under the moonless, star-dusted sky. The trees were an indistinct mass, a texture rather than a collection of individual objects. Without thinking, my eyes began to pick out the silhouettes against the starfield. 1, 2, 3. I caught myself on the fourth tree, a wry smile touching my lips. The power of suggestion. Even I, a man of science, was susceptible. How amusing. TQMP. The sound was loud, sharp, and directly overhead. It was a single, definitive impact on the roof of the cabin. My head snapped up, my heart suddenly hammering against my ribs. The sound was utterly alien in the vast, whispering silence. It was heavy. Not the skittering of a squirrel or the gentle landing of a pine cone. It was a solid, weighty thud, as if someone had dropped a heavy sack of grain onto the metal roof. My mind, conditioned by years of training, immediately began to cycle through rational explanations. A large bird, perhaps an owl or an eagle, dropping its prey. A heavy branch, weakened by rot, finally falling from a nearby pine and striking the roof on its way down. Thermal contraction of the metal roof as the temperature dropped, causing a sudden, loud pop. Each explanation was plausible. Each was logical. I stood up and listened, straight up my ears against the sound of my own breathing. There was nothing but the wind. No scratching, no follow-up sounds. Just the single, isolated impact. After a minute that felt like 10, I sat back down, my pulse gradually slowing. It was a bird. It had to be a bird. But the textbook on my desk remained unread. My focus was gone, shattered by that one intrusive sound. My eyes kept flicking back to the eastern window, to the black, uncountable trees. After another half hour of feigned concentration, I gave up. I stood, walked over to the shelf, and pulled out the thick logbook. My fingers found the laminated sheet, tucked in the back. I pulled it out and laid it on the desk, the cheap plastic glinting in the lamplight. I read it again. The amusement was gone. The academic curiosity had vanished. Staring at the words alone in my glass box, suspended 100 feet above a silent, black wilderness, I felt a cold, unfamiliar sensation creep into the room. It was the chilling possibility, however remote, that the list was not a joke, that it was not folklore, that it was, in fact, exactly what it claimed to be: a list of rules for staying alive. Sleep did not come easily that night. Every gust of wind against the tower sounded like a prelude to another impact. Every creak of the steel frame a footstep on the stairs. The single, solid thump had acted as a tuning fork, attuning my senses to a frequency of fear I hadn't known existed. My scientific mind, my greatest defense, was now a traitor, relentlessly replaying the sound and finding every of my rational explanations wanting. A bird dropping prey wouldn't have been so heavy, so final. A falling branch would have scraped or rolled. Thermal contraction was a sharp pop, not a dead, weighted blow. I lay on my cot, staring into the oppressive darkness of the cabin, feeling the 100-foot drop beneath me not as a matter of elevation, but as a measure of my own vulnerability. The glass walls, once a source of wonder, now felt like the brittle shell of an egg. The following morning, I awoke unrested, the dawn light painting the eastern sky in hues of bruised purple and soft rose. The world outside was serene, majestic, utterly indifferent to my nocturnal anxieties. The dissonance was jarring. I made my coffee, my movements stiff, and performed my morning sweep of the horizon. The forest was still, the air crisp. Nothing was out of place, and yet everything felt different. The silence no longer felt peaceful, it felt watchful. The isolation was no longer a comfort, it was a threat. The laminated list of rules. At my desk, where I had left it, a pale rectangle in the morning light. I picked it up, my fingers tracing the typewritten words. It was a psychological artifact, I told myself again. A remnant of a predecessor's fraying sanity. But the thump had given it weight. It had become an artifact of a different kind. Not psychological, but perhaps physical. A warning. My eyes fell on rule number 5. Keep the windows polished. It doesn't like looking through filth. Of all the bizarre injunctions, this one seemed the most benign, the most easily dismissed as the eccentricity of a fastidious former lookout. And yet, an idea took root in my mind, a thought born of sleeplessness and a creeping, irrational dread. Following the rule wouldn't hurt. It was a simple, manual task, something to occupy my hands and quiet my racing thoughts. It would be an act of restoring order, a way to reclaim my sanctuary from the encroaching strangeness. At least, that's the logic I presented to myself. The truth, I suspect, was that I was scared, and I was hedging my bets against a reality I wasn't ready to accept. I spent the next hour meticulously cleaning the panoramic windows. I used the supplied vinegar solution and old newspapers, working in slow, deliberate circles, buffing away every speck of dust, every stray fingerprint, every dried raindrop. With each pane I cleaned, the world outside became sharper, more vivid, the vast sea of green more immediate. But the task did not bring the comfort I had sought. Instead, a new and deeply unsettling feeling began to creep over me. The act of polishing the glass, of making it perfectly transparent, felt less like cleaning and more like a placatory offering. I wasn't just cleaning windows, I was preparing a viewing portal. The thought was absurd, but it was persistent. Who or what was I preparing it for? The line from the list echoed in my mind. It doesn't like looking through filth. The implication was clear. It did like looking. The clearer the view, the better. As I finished the final pane, the cabin felt more exposed than ever. A transparent cage suspended in the air for the scrutiny of an unseen observer. The feeling of being watched was no longer a vague premonition. It was a palpable presence, pressing in from all sides. 3 more days passed. The profound unease lingered, a low hum of anxiety beneath the surface of my daily routine. I tried to lose myself in my work, cataloging plant specimens I'd collected on the hike up, cross-referencing my notes with textbooks, but my focus was fractured. My gaze would constantly drift from the page to the wilderness beyond the glass, scanning the tree line, searching the shadows. I was looking for something, though I didn't know what. I was a scientist reduced to a nervous animal, startled by the snap of a twig, the cry of a distant hawk. It was on the afternoon of the 7th day that I saw him. I was scanning the lower slopes of the mountain with my binoculars, following the thin ribbon of the trail that snaked through the trees about a mile below the tower. And there he was, a lone hiker, moving steadily up the path. My first reaction was a surge of pure, unadulterated relief. Another human being. The sight was so welcome, so grounding, that it almost brought tears to my eyes. The crushing weight of the solitude lifted instantly. I wanted to run to the radio, to hail him, to hear another voice, to confirm that the world of people and reason still existed. My hand was on the radio's handset when I froze. Rule number 6 slammed into my consciousness of the force of a physical blow. Sometimes you'll see a lone hiker on the trail below. Do not hail them. They are not lost. My heart, which had soared with relief, now plummeted into a cold abyss of dread. I lifted the binoculars again, my hands trembling slightly. I studied the figure. He was dressed in simple hiking gear, dark pants, a red jacket. But something was wrong. His pace was too regular, too metronomic. He moved over the uneven, root-snarled ground, with a liquid smoothness that was unnatural, never breaking stride, never pausing to catch his breath or check his surroundings. He carried no pack, no water bottle, nothing. His head was bare, and he never looked up, his gaze fixed on the path before him with an unnerving intensity. He was simply moving. My scientific training screamed at me to observe, to document. My profound loneliness begged me to make contact. But the list, and the cold certainty that had settled in my gut, held me paralyzed. This was a test. The hiker was a question, and I knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that answering it would be a catastrophic mistake. For what felt like an hour, I watched him. He continued his steady, relentless ascent, a small, red figure against the immense green backdrop. He never faltered. He never looked toward the tower. It was as if he knew I was there, and knew I was watching, and the knowledge was all the connection he required. As he rounded a large granite outcropping, he passed behind it and did not re-emerge. I kept the binoculars trained on the spot, my eyes burning with the strain of not blinded. 1 minute. 5. 10. The trail on the other side of the rock remained empty. He was gone. He hadn't turned back. I would have seen him. He hadn't scrambled up the rock face. He had simply vanished. He was not lost. The words resonated with a terrifying new meaning. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. That night, the tower felt less like a sanctuary and more like a tomb. The rationalizations were gone, stripped away by the sight of the impossible hiker. The world I had known, a world governed by predictable physical laws, had been a fragile illusion. I was in a new place now, a place with different rules. The laminated sheet on my desk was no longer a curiosity. It was my only map, my only guide to navigating this terrifying new territory. I tried to read, but the words were meaningless squiggles on the page. The silence in the cabin was absolute. I found myself listening, straining for any sound, dreading it and craving it in equal measure. The hours ticked by. Midnight came and went. It was somewhere deep in the heart of the night, perhaps 2 in the morning, when the silence was finally broken. Crackle. Hiss. The sound came from the radio. A burst of static, sharp and loud in the dead quiet. My entire body went rigid. The radio was off. I knew it was off. I had turned it off myself after Miller left, and hadn't used it since my aborted attempt to hail the hiker. Crackle. And then a sound began to emerge from the static, faint at first, then growing clearer. It was music, or something like it. A thin, reedy melody, like a warped music box, played on an instrument I couldn't name. And beneath it, a voice. It was a high, wavering voice, singing in a language I didn't recognize. The words were soft, sibilant, and structured with a cadence that was hypnotic and deeply wrong. It was a lullaby sung by something that had never been a child. Rule number 4. If you hear singing on the radio after midnight, it's not the radio. Turn the unit off and do not turn it on again until sunrise. Don't try to make out the words. But the radio was off. I stared at the dark, inert unit, at the power switch firmly in the off position, as the impossible. Ethereal music filled my glass cage. My mind reeled. This wasn't a signal from a distant station. This wasn't a prank. This was something else. The rule was wrong. It wasn't the radio. It was coming through the radio. A part of me, the scientist, the observer, wanted to listen. It wanted to lean closer, to parse the words, to understand the melody, to record this impossible phenomenon. But the part of me that had watched the hiker vanish, the part that had felt the weight of the felt on the roof, the part that now understood the chilling truth of the rules, screamed in silent terror. Don't try to make out the words. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled panic, I lunged for the radio. My hand closed not on the power switch. What good would that do? But on the power cable itself. I yanked it from the wall with all my strength. The plug came free with a sharp crack. The singing stopped. The silence that crashed back in was more profound, more terrifying than any sound I had ever heard. It was a void, a vacuum left by the removal of that alien melody. I stood panting in the darkness, the useless power cord clutched in my hand, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I was alone in my glass box, 100 feet in the air, with the chilling, absolute certainty that I was not alone at all. The silence that followed the unplugging of the radio was a physical entity. It pressed in on me, heavier and more menacing than the alien song it had replaced. I stood frozen in the center of the cabin, the useless power cord clutched in my fist like a talisman, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The scientific part of my brain, the calm, rational observer that had defined my entire adult life, had gone silent. It had been murdered by a series of impossible events, and in its place was a primal, terrified animal. My world had been governed by principles of physics and biology, but I was no longer in that world. I was in a place governed by a laminated sheet of paper. The rules were no longer a curiosity or a warning. They were the only physics that mattered now. I didn't sleep. I spent the remainder of the night sitting on my cot with my back against the wall, my eyes fixed on the trapdoor, listening. Every creak of the tower in the wind was a footstep, every flutter of a passing moth against the glass a prelude to a new horror. When the first hint of dawn finally broke, painting the eastern sky in sick, gray light, it brought no relief, only a clearer view of my prison. The majestic wilderness I had admired just days ago now seemed like a vast, patient predator, and I was a morsel of life, trapped in a glass display case, waiting to be consumed. My academic research, the very reason for my being here, was a forgotten relic. My textbooks and notes lay untouched. My new purpose was singular and absolute: survive. Survive until Miller returned. Survive by adhering to the rules. The list was my scripture now, my only hope of navigating the suffocating dread that had become my reality. My gaze was drawn, against my will, to the eastern valley. It was the direction the hiker had taken, the direction from which the impossible psalm had seemed to emanate. And it was the subject of the final, most cryptic rule. Rule number 7. Never count the trees in the eastern valley. You'll get the number wrong every time, and it notices when you try. The rule was an assault on reason itself. How could one get the number wrong every time? And the final clause: it notices when you try. This implied not just a phenomenon, but an intelligence, a sentient, watchful presence that was somehow to the very act of perception. The thought was so monstrously absurd that it sent a fresh wave of nausea through me. I forced myself to look away, focusing on the mundane tasks of survival. I checked the guy wires, Rule 1. I ensured my food was sealed and secure. Through 2. I left the radio unplugged and untouched. Rule 4. I polished the already gleaming windows until my arms ached. Rule 5. I performed these tasks with the desperate fervor of a zealot. Each completed rule a small prayer against the encroaching darkness, driven by a desperate need for answers, for any context at all. I turned to the official logbook again. I wasn't looking for the rules this time. I was looking for their author. I flipped back through the pages, past the neat, blocky entries of the last few years, going back decades. The entries were mostly mundane weather reports, animal sightings, supply notes. But as I got closer to the present, a subtle shift began to appear. 15 years ago, a lookout named Harris had written, "Bad air from the east today. Smells like ozone and old cellars." 7 years ago, a woman named Sarah had noted, "Jim says he hears singing at night. Think the solitude is getting to him." Then I found the entries from my immediate predecessor, a man named Graham. His handwriting, initially as neat as all the others, grew progressively more erratic over his final month. His last few entries were chilling. July 12th, windows clean. It's quiet today. Too quiet. The hiker was on the trail again. Same red jacket. Didn't look up. July 15th. The singing started early tonight. I didn't have the radio on. Sarah was right, it's not the radio. July 18th. A magpie hit the roof today. Just one loud thump. The sound was too heavy for a bird. My blood ran cold. He had experienced the same things. The hiker, the singing, the thump. This wasn't my private madness. It was a feature of the tower itself. I flipped to his final entry, dated just a week before my arrival. The handwriting was a barely legible scrawl, the pen having dug deep into the paper. July 21st, 103. God, forgive me. I couldn't help it. It's wrong. The number is wrong. It knows I looked. It knows I. The entry stopped there. The rest of the page was blank. Graham had broken Rule 7. And then he was gone. A tremor of pure terror shot through me. I slammed the book shut, a cloud of dust motes dancing in the lamplight. The rules weren't just a guide. They were a litany of failed experiments, each one likely written in the blood of someone who had learned the hard way. Later that day, a new test presented itself. I was preparing a meager lunch of canned beans when my hand, slick with sweat, fumbled a small packet of saltine crackers. It slipped from my grasp, bounced off the edge of the open trapdoor, and fell to the metal platform of the catwalk below. I froze, my heart hammering. Rule number 2. Don't leave food scraps or packaging outside. The bears are one thing, the smaller critters are the real problem. My first instinct was to leave it. It was just a small packet of crackers. What harm could it do? But Graham's final, frantic entry echoed in my mind. The rules were absolute. The smaller critters were the real problem. What did that mean? I had to retrieve it. With a deep sense of foreboding, I unbolted the trapdoor and slowly, cautiously, made my way down the 133 steps. The open air, which should have felt liberating after the confines of the cabin, felt heavy and oppressive. The silence was thick, watchful. I reached the catwalk and looked for the small, cellophane-wrapped package. It was gone. In its place, sitting precisely where the crackers should have been, was a single, smooth, black river stone. It was perfectly ovoid, dark as coal, and cool to the touch despite the afternoon sun. It was utterly alien to this granite mountaintop. It was an exchange. A receipt. Something had taken the crackers and left this token in their place. I stared at it for a long moment before snatching it up, scrambling back up the stairs and bolting the trapdoor behind me as if pursued by demons. I threw the stone into the far corner of the room, where it landed with a soft thud. The pressure was becoming unbearable. The isolation, the constant vigilance, the knowledge of Graham's fate. It was all eroding my sanity, grinding me down. I found myself staring at the Eastern Valley again, the place where the rules converged. My eyes darted across the canopy, deliberately blurring my focus, trying to see the trees as a single, textured mass, a watercolor wash of green. But my mind, a tool trained for observation and analysis, betrayed me. Without conscious thought, without intent, my eyes began to pick out individual silhouettes against the sky. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. A strangled gasp escaped my lips. I clamped my hands over my mouth, my eyes wide with the horror of my own involuntary betrayal. I had done it. I had tried to count. I had looked. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. A sliver of hope, fragile and desperate, pierced through my terror. Maybe it was just a superstition. Maybe Graham's disappearance was a coincidence. Maybe a low hum began, vibrating up through the soles of my feet. It was a deep, resonant frequency that seemed to emanate from the very bedrock of the mountain. A sound felt more than heard. It was coming from the east. I forced my eyes toward the Eastern Valley, my body trembling uncontrollably. And I saw it. Among the millions of silent, motionless pines, one tree, a tall, distinctive lodgepole about a mile distant, began to move. There was no wind. The air was perfectly still. But the tree began to sway, slowly, deliberately, back and forth. It was not the random, chaotic motion of a tree in a storm. It was a rhythmic, hypnotic gesture. It was a finger beckoning. The swaying stopped. The humming ceased. The silence that returned was absolute, charged with a terrible, triumphant finality. It was the silence of a predator that has been seen by its prey and is now content to wait. I stumbled backward, away from the window, my legs giving way as I collapsed onto the floor. And then I heard it. A new sound. Tap. It was soft, sharp, and distinct. Tap, tap. It was coming from the glass of the eastern window. A light, insistent rapping, like a single fingernail, tapping on the pane from the outside. 100 feet above the ground. The sound was delicate, precise, and utterly impossible. It was the sound of a single fingernail against the thick plate glass of the eastern window. 100 feet in the air. My mind, already fractured by the events of the past week, simply refused to process it. I was paralyzed on the floor, my back pressed against the leg of the desk, staring at the point on the glass where the sound originated. There was nothing there. Just the infinite, star-dusted blackness of the night sky. Tap. It moved. The sound shifted to the next pane of glass to the south, then the next, methodically making its way around the cabin. It was testing the perimeter. It was a spider circling its web, checking for the vibrations of trapped prey. I was the prey. I scrambled backward on all fours, crab, walking away from the windows, trying to put as much distance as possible between myself and the glass. My world had shrunk from the vast wilderness to the 14 by 14 foot confines of the cabin, and now it was shrinking further to the small island of floorboards around the central fire finder. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It was an expectant silence, the held breath before a scream. I waited, my entire being a knot of raw, screaming terror. And then, a new sound began. A low, wet, scraping noise. It was the sound of something heavy and soft being dragged across the glass. It moved up the eastern window, leaving a faint, glistening trail in the starlight, a smear of obscene translucence. My mind flashed to Rule Fefi: keep the windows polished. It doesn't like looking through filth. I had polished them to a perfect sheen. I had made it easy for it to see in. I hadn't been cleaning my home. I had been setting a dinner table. Alistair. The voice was not a sound that traveled through the air. It bloomed inside my skull, a perfect replica of the ranger. Miller's gruff baritone. It was calm, reasonable. Alistair, you need to open the door. Your predecessor, Graham. He had a breakdown. We need to get you out of there. I squeezed my eyes shut, shaking my head violently. It wasn't real. Miller was miles away, safe in the world of people and logic. This was a trick. A lure. The scraping stopped and the voice changed, morphing into the soft, academic tones of my university mentor, Dr. Albright. The specimen, Alistair. The one you saw. The tree. Your observation was incomplete. A true scientist would document it properly. You have to look. You have to finish the count. How can you publish without complete data? This was a more insidious attack, a violation of my very identity. It was using my own mind, my own ambitions, against me. It was twisting the core of who I was into a weapon for my own destruction. The voice was a hook, baited with my life's work, and I could feel my resolve beginning to fray. The desire to know, to understand, was so deeply ingrained in me that it fought against my instinct for survival. I won't, I whispered, the words a dry rasp in my throat. I won't look. The voice sighed, a sound of pure static and disappointment that echoed in my sinuses. Very well. The scraping resumed, faster this time. More frantic. It was no longer just a sound. I could feel the vibrations through the floor. The entire tower began to sway, not with the rhythmic motion of the wind, but with a violent, jerky shudder, as if a giant hand had seized the top of the structure and was trying to shake it apart. The guy. Wires shrieked in protest. A chorus of tortured metal. Books and instruments tumbled from the shelves, crashing to the floor. The Black River stone. The token from the smaller critters rolled out from under the cot and came to a stop near my foot. And then came the pressure. A deep, resonant groan emanated from the glass of the eastern window. A spiderweb of fine cracks appeared in the corner of the pane, spreading inward like blooming ice crystals. The glass was bowing inward, the pressure from the outside immense, relentless. It was going to break. The barrier between my world and its was about to be shattered. In that moment of absolute, final terror, a strange clarity descended upon me. My scientific mind, the one I thought had been murdered, flickered back to life. But it was changed, warped by the horrors it had witnessed. It was no longer interested in botany. It was interested in the rules of this new, terrible reality. Graham's final, unfinished entry flashed in my mind. It knows I looked. It knows I finally understood. Graham hadn't been attacked. He hadn't been dragged away. He had been trying to warn me. He had been trying to write a new rule. With a surge of adrenaline born of desperate insight, I lunged for my personal logbook, which had fallen to the floor. I fumbled for my pen, my hands shaking so violently I could barely grip it. The groaning of the glass grew louder, the cracks spreading across the entire pane. Any second now it would shatter. I ignored the voice, which was now screaming in my head, a cacophony of every person I had ever known. I ignored the shuddering of the tower. I ignored the imminent implosion of the window. I opened the logbook to a fresh page and began to write, my handwriting a frantic, jagged scrawl. I wasn't writing for myself. I was writing for the next person, for the poor, unsuspecting soul who would come after me, seeking solitude and finding this place of ancient, hungry intelligence. My pen flew across the page. I didn't write an observation. I didn't write a plea for help. I wrote a rule, a new piece of the only scripture that mattered here. The groaning of the glass reached a fever pitch, a high-pitched scream of tortured material. The pressure in the cabin became unbearable, my eardrums threatening to burst. I could see a shape pressing against the glass now, a vast, dark form that blotted out the stars. Something with too many joints and a texture like wet leather. It was a thing of profound wrongness, a creature whose very existence was a violation of natural law. I finished writing the last word just as the window exploded inward. A hurricane of glass shards and icy, pine-scented air ripped through the cabin. The lamp was extinguished, plunging me into absolute darkness. The pressure, the voice, the shaking, it all stopped. A profound silence fell, broken only by the sound of my own rag, breathing, and the gentle tinkle of a few remaining pieces of glass falling from the window frame. I was alive. I was in darkness, surrounded by wreckage, but I was alive. The presence was gone. It was as if, by completing the rule, by adding to the canon of this place, I had satisfied it. I had paid a toll. I don't know how long I sat there in the dark. Hours, maybe. When the sun finally rose, I did not feel its warmth. I stood up, my body a symphony of aches and cuts from the flying glass. I looked at the shattered eastern window, a gaping wound open to the sky. Then I looked down at what I had written. My logbook lay open on the floor. On the page, in my own frantic hand, was a single sentence. If you break a rule, you must write the next one before it gets in. I stayed in the tower for 3 more days, a ghost in a shattered box. I did not eat. I did not sleep. I just watched the empty space where the window had been. On the 4th day, I heard the distant rumble of a truck engine. Miller was coming. I took the laminated sheet of rules from my desk. With a piece of tape from my first aid kit, I carefully affixed the page I had torn from my logbook to the bottom of it. I placed the newly amended list back inside the official logbook, tucking it into the back cover. When Miller finally climbed the last few steps and opened the trapdoor, he found me sitting at my desk, staring out at the eastern valley. What the hell happened here? A bear? He asked, his eyes wide as he took in the shattered glass and the wreckage of the cabin. I turned to look at him, and I saw the flicker of fear in his eyes as he saw my face. I knew I was no longer the man who had arrived weeks ago. The academic was gone, replaced by something else. Something that had looked into a different kind of wilderness and had been changed by what it saw. Something like that. I said, my voice hollow. It's a quiet post. Nothing ever happens here. I gathered my remaining things in silence and followed him down the stairs, never once looking back at the glass box in the green sea. I knew I was leaving, but I also knew, with a chilling certainty, that a part of me would remain there forever. I was the new rule. I was the new warning. And I knew that someday, someone else would come. They would find the list. And they would have to learn, just as Graham and I had learned, that some places have rules for a reason, and that the price for breaking them is to become a part of the story yourself.